Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Graham Winter and Martin Bean. Good morning or good evening to you both.
Hey, Julian.
Hi, Julian.
Good to see you. Well, Graham, you are a best-selling author of Think One Team, the founder of consultancy Think One Team, and a three-time Australian Olympic team chief psychologist. And Martin, you are the CEO of the Bean Centre, former Vice Chancellor and President of RMIT University, and the former Vice Chancellor of the Open University. And today we're going to be exploring sustainable performance or high performance and well-being, and see if we can sort of marry those together. And is there a sort of a midpoint of bringing that all together? Before we get into that conversation, just good to know and just to hear from you both about very briefly, what do you love about what you do? So I'll start with you, Martin, first.
Oh, it's a great question, Julian. Thank you. So I describe myself as being in the preferment stage of my career now, Julian. So I only work on things that I prefer to work on. And it's a stage of my career that I've been planning since my 30s, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And the reason is because I get to really follow the passions of what I love doing now, and having the freedom and flexibility to pick and choose the people I work with, the projects I work on. And more importantly, and I think this is something Graham and I have in common, we're sort of at that stage in our career now where, without being melodramatic, we're really looking to leave a little bit of a legacy or our fingerprints on the quality of leaders and teams, not just in Australia and New Zealand, but increasingly around the world as well. So that's what I love.
Fantastic.
Julian, my interest, I think, has always been working with this sort of, I guess, I suppose I call it on the edge of high performance, having worked in both the elite sport and the business areas. These days, somebody actually asked me a couple of weeks ago, I was doing some work with them on their purpose. And they said, so what about you? And I said, actually, I just love working with high performers to help them to tackle some of their most complex problems and to pursue their biggest opportunities. And, it's a real privilege to do that, because every conversation you have, you learn more than you give. And I'm sure we'll share some of that in the conversation today.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Martin. So we're talking high performance today. And I'd like to get, I suppose, an understanding or thought on what is the problem with high performance. It's all very well, we all shoot for high performers, but there's something can come with it in terms of problems or difficulties can come with it. So I don't ask Martin, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the challenge, obviously, in high performance by definition means you're in a demanding environment. You're in an environment where you've got to bring your best. And Graham can talk about that in the sporting context. I've certainly experienced that in the leadership context in a number of different ways. But I think that the challenge of high performance then is, how do you, in the face of all of that turbulence and uncertainty, take care of yourself, Julian? What are the things that you've got to do to ensure that you can remain resilient, that you can remain in your A game, so that you can then be the best you can be for your people? And so a lot of what I talk to leaders about as they're trying to maintain that performance is what they need to do to actually step back every now and again and reflect regularly, take the time to look at what's going on and not just react to it, but take the time to reflect and adapt to it. I also talk a lot about seeking feedback from people that you trust. You want to be careful when you're a high performer that you don't listen to everybody and try to please everybody. You'll end up just driving yourself crazy and probably giving yourself some damage. And then the third one, which is increasingly coming to the fore, Julian, and I'm delighted that it's hit the mainstream now, is just practicing mindfulness. And that's really taking care of mind as well as body. And that will be something different for every person. For those people that use an Apple Watch, for example, they really reinforce breathing exercises and breath work as part of that. But it's really about helping people that are in that high performance mode to sort of cultivate that self-awareness and that mindfulness, because goodness knows, unless you do that, if you remain high performing without the release, then my experience is it usually leads to what a lot of people refer to as burnout. And that often leads to people running away from things that they love simply because they need the break, rather than managing themselves at peak performance, Julian.
And Graham, you've worked with Olympic teams, which I'm sure each cycle of the Olympics have a target of a number of medals they're going for, which probably puts incredible pressure on the athletes. And I know certainly in the UK, medals equal funding for the next cycle. I'm sure Australia works in a similar mechanism, but just trying to raise the profile of the country. How do you sort of marry that sort of pushing for high performance, but maintain that balance of well-being? Because I think that's quite tricky, isn't it, when you're really at the edge of high performance?
Yeah, it is, Julian. I'm going back almost 30 years now to a meeting I sat in pre the Sydney Olympics, where it was very clearly spelled out to us that it would not be a successful home Olympics unless the Australian Olympic team finished in the top 5 in the world. And that was very clearly spelled out in colours of gold, silver and bronze. But I think, and I reflect a bit on what Martin said, high performance has a cost, but it has benefits. And when you're working with people at that level, I find I'm constantly using the word sustainable high performance. And I'm also helping people to recognise that there is a distinct difference between peak and sustainable performance. So for athletes, you're looking at individuals who are trying to produce excellence, often in a very short period of time. So maybe 10 seconds or less than 10 seconds, or it might be just over a short period of an Olympic Games. Business people, on the other hand, the executives that I work with, the leadership teams I work with, they're in a much more long-term experience where, yes, they need moments of exceptional performance if they're presenting or having difficult conversations. But to me, it's about building the awareness of the person to be able to bring out the best when they need to bring it out, but also to be able to sustain that. And a lot of the conversations I just spent this afternoon, a 90-minute coaching session with a chief executive, and we spent a lot of time talking about that cost benefit, trade-offs, and just making sure that he's got the right levels of energy, the right focus, and I think just aware and understanding his own psyche in that environment so that he can be the best he can be in that environment and doesn't, as Martin suggests, end up in that burnout, which I certainly see a lot in business, and I've seen some pretty tragic experiences of athletes who the public might see as being high performers, but they're not. They're not elite psychologically, and that can have huge costs if you put them in those high demand environments.
And Graham, you sort of talked about the sort of costs benefits, and it feels like almost a seesaw effect here and balance. And is that because that feels like you high performance here, but you're going to lose here. If you gain in the sort of more well-being, you're going to lose in performance. How do we sort of work that through? Because that feels quite sort of taking one and giving to another, and quite a juggling act of life, isn't it?
Well, I think it is. I mean, the terminology work-life balance has sort of been around for a long time. I think it's probably had its time. I think it's more that integration of our work or our craft, our profession with our life. I mean, Martin and I use a framework, simple acronym is ADEP. So the 4 elements are achievement, so achieving meaningful outcomes, development, so developing and growing, energy and enjoyment, and then partnering relationships. And if you look at some of the psych research around high performance and burnout and so on, what you'll find is if over a period of time people can balance those 4 elements, that sense of achievement, development, the enjoyment and the energy, and then the collegiate partnering relationships, there is a much lower, in fact, a very low level experience of burnout. So you're right, it's an exercise in balance, but that's not balance in a given moment, because they will almost always overspend in one of those areas at any given time if they're in high performance mode, for example, or if they're in development mode. But if one of those are in play, or in miss rather, you start to see the costs.
Okay. And so Martin, in terms of, you alluded to the whole piece on burnout, the fact that if we don't get this right and we just push for high performance without managing our well-being, a burnout might happen along the way. What will be the early signs for a leader right now who's listening and thinking, I'm working really hard, I'm being successful, but actually there's potentially some signs that they're manifesting right now that could be alluding to a burnout situation for them?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And the things that I observe, well, first of all, they're probably pretty self-aware that they're not 100% in right now, that they feel themselves going defensive rather than adaptive. So their thinking has sort of gone to shy away from the issue, either sort of be almost passive in the way they go about being defensive, stay under the radar, try not to be seen, try not to take risks, or they go aggressive. They come out swinging. They see themselves in competition with everybody. They're constantly comparing themselves with others, but they've gone defensive. In both of those cases, they've gone defensive. And I think for many leaders, that is the clearest sign of whether they are on a pathway to burnout, because there's a reason why they've gone defensive. We're all pre-wired to do it in high performance or confronting environments. You know, as human beings, flight or fight, we have a tendency to be pushed towards defensive thinking. But it's when you start living in that space and your decisions start being made in that space, you're avoiding things, you're trying to please everybody, you're competing rather than collaborating. And of course, as a leader, well, first of all, that's both a challenge for yourself, because it's hard to be motivated and fulfilled when you're living in that defensive space. But it's really hard for a team that you're leading as well, because you can quite often lead the whole group into that defensive mindset, and everybody sort of loses in that game, Julian. So when I see a leader in that space of defensiveness rather than opportunity thinking, which is all about, you know, confronting the challenge, running towards it, you know, taking risks and failure as an opportunity to learn, delegating and empowering people, that's usually the conversation I have, which is, hey, you know, you're capable of being a very different person. What's going on? Well, you know, where are you at? And I think Graham's comment that he just made about you can't segregate people into what's going on in their work and what's going on in their life. It's just you. It's you as a human being. And so typically I'll look for those telltale signs. And then usually what I do is take them to that really simple model of where are you in the continuum from defensive thinking versus opportunity thinking. What's driven you there, and what do you need to do to sort of compartmentalize and run towards the discomfort and embrace the challenge rather than shying away from it, Julian. And I know, you know, a quick story, when the Australian Prime Minister announced heading into COVID that the borders were closing, and, sort of on the day, I don't know why he did it, but he basically told all of our international students just to go home. I remember sitting in a room with my leadership team, and this model was up on the screen because Graham was coaching my team. And I was sitting off to the side, and I remember looking at that defensive versus opportunity model. And I suddenly had this light bulb moment, Julian, that, oh my goodness, I am so defensive. You know, I am worried about everything that could go wrong. And actually what this group of people needed from me at that moment was to not think about everything that could go wrong, but was to start stepping up with them and start thinking about what we needed to do to make sure everything turned out well. So that's sort of a personal story that lives with me to this day of how a high performer, because I was a pretty high performer, but almost overnight, I was driven into sort of that burnout or defensive mode because of the externality of the change that was going on. And so one of the things, you know, I think I often talk to leaders about is sort of accept the externality of change, accept what you can control and what you can't control, and focus on the things that you can, Julian.
Yeah, I think we've all got our COVID stories. What happened in the state of shock and how we reacted, and whether that was a good thing or bad thing. But we'll learn from that as individuals. That's the key thing. And it's interesting. You talked about, you had that awareness. You were aware that you were in a defensive mode and recognized that. How and all the signs you're talking about requires that self-awareness, requires that ability to know what's going on with myself and how I'm reacting, how I'm interacting with my team. How do we hone that a bit more? How do we increase that self-awareness, Martin? What have your experience with that?
I think it's the first step is just really reflecting on when you are in that defensive state and what are the telltale signs for you, Julian. You know, all the expressions in the English language of having the knot in the pit of your stomach, or the weight of the world on your shoulders, or the blood draining from your head to to your extremities. We all experience it in different ways. I'm sure the people watching or listening to this podcast, they'll know it. They'll know when they're in that anxious state and how they feel. A lot of people describe it as the walls closing in or feeling like they're. So I think the first step is to recognize what are the emotional and physiological experiences that you have, and then cut yourself a break. Recognize they're perfectly natural feelings and reactions. It's the way we're wired. But then it's about building your own playbook. It's then knowing what works for you to get yourself into the right space. I know for me, once I've recognized that I'm in that space, the very best thing I can do is break the problem or challenges down. I often describe it as break it down, look at what needs to get done, think of it as a hurdle race, put one foot after the other and tackle each hurdle one at a time, rather than allowing myself to get overwhelmed by the totality of what I'm confronting. Now that's what works for me. And I literally now down tools, pull out a blank sheet of paper and break the problem and challenge down and put it in a logical order. And I find that is how I compartmentalize and go back to opportunity. I've got others that I coach and work with where they have to get out into nature and take a walk and get some fresh air. I've got others that just need a few moments to sit and reflect and practice mindfulness. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I think recognize when you're there, find your own toolkit of what are the techniques that work for you, use those techniques. So take the time out, get you compartmentalize and get yourself back into that good state. But then the last thing I'll share, Julian, is, but then you've got to have the courage to unpack it on the back end. Because if you bottle all of that up and you just simply contain it and you don't have your way of releasing it afterwards by talking it through with a confidant, by having your safe space with people that you love or they all care for, and knowing that you can be vulnerable and talk about what's going on for you. So I don't want to talk about the first steps without talking about the need to find that way to release all of that stress and energy afterwards, Julian.
I guess building upon that is ensuring having a community around you, people around you, whether that's close friends, advisors, coaches, that can assist you with that and point out and help you and challenge you at times. And I think that's important. We need people around because sometimes we don't always know what's going on in our own world. We don't always know what exactly we're doing because we're so in it, and so we can't see the wood for the tree, so to speak. I think it's helpful to have that different perspectives. Now, Graham, you mentioned about this whole sustainable performance and having that approach to try and get sustainable high performance. So what are the barriers for achieving sustainable high performance?
I might just take what Martin's just said and put it in one of those little models where psychologists get trained in called awareness, acceptance, action. So it's an easy one for listeners to remember. So Martin's talked about understanding yourself and being aware of what's going on. So spotting those signs and signals that you an athlete would say, I'm not in my zone. I'm losing a bit of rhythm, timing. An executive would say, I know I'm getting a bit short with people around me. My thinking's not as clear. So the first thing is to be aware. So the barrier is lack of awareness. That's probably the one that's going to blow you up first and probably blow you up most. The second, then, if you sort of go awareness, acceptance, it's the defensiveness. It's the tendency not to, excuse me, it's the tendency to think that what's going on for you is not natural and not normal, and therefore you get angry with yourself, you ignore it. So there's a whole variety of things that I think people can do that essentially mean we just don't accept that as being a natural state. So people can an athlete will lose confidence. A business leader will sort of get caught up in the why am I stressed, why am I struggling, or whatever. And then I think the action piece, again, drawing on what we've just said, probably two pieces to it, and you both mentioned them. One is perspective. That if we don't get perspective or we don't get up on the balcony, we're on the stage if you're a high performer. So you've got to get on that balcony occasionally because there's so much going on around you. But the second one also is every piece of research tells us that when you're in those high demand environments, that you're going to be more successful, you're going to be more confident, you're going to be less anxious if you go towards the challenge. So if you put those two together, perspectives gives you how do I go towards it, but how do I go towards it in a risk sort of balanced way. So So I would simply say to your listeners, keep those 3 A's in mind. Awareness. Am I aware of when I am dropping into that defensive state? One of the common signs for burnout is people start to resent what they're doing. Watch that, for example. Then it's an acceptance. Yep, that's okay. I'm a human being, but I'm going to have to be a little vulnerable here. Might need to chat to somebody. Might need to just accept that, hey, a bit of the knot in the stomach's part of being a high performer. And then action. And that's action with colleagues and perspective. But it's also, you're the performer. You got to go and do it. So move forward.
And Graham, just again, building upon that, we're talking about sustainable high performance as the leader, but as a leader then leads a team, and that needs to sort of translate within to the team or within to the organization. So how do we sort of take that individual sort of learnings and that awareness and start to create a culture within the team that therefore then permeates the whole organization for that sustainable high performance?
I think it's recognizing that high performance sits in this sort of sweet spot between psychological safety, which is this sense of I feel confident to be bold and to be confident, to be myself and to speak up and to experiment and learn. But equally, it's this sense of accountability as well. And I think we are seeing probably a little too much in the corporate world at the moment. And dare I say, but I think coming out of HR departments, way too much focus on psychological safety and letting it bleed into psychosocial issues rather than recognizing that psychological safety and the research from Harvard and Associated is about team performance. And it's about putting those two together. So it's creating the environment in which you can be yourself, but it's equally a sense of what that collective accountability is to purpose, to values, to standards, and to goals. And it's the leader who plays the biggest role in setting that. But I do think, and I have done this a number of times over the last sort of 4 or 5 months, getting a really clear narrative for the leadership team to have a conversation with their people about what a high performance environment is for them. And it's the intersection of those two. I suppose the language I'd use, that's your one team environment, high psych safety, collective accountability. That's the sweet spot we're looking for.
And Martin, we alluded to the sort of almost the self-awareness and almost this sort of selfness in terms of as a leader. And you started to talk about mindfulness. What are the self-care practices that you do personally that have helped you develop your awareness, your self-awareness, but also help you navigate those sort of difficulties in life?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the ones that work best for me, and I'm sure a lot of the people watching and listening will relate to this, when we hit sort of stressful times, we're our own worst enemies, Julian. So, when I'm stressed, I have a tendency to not sleep well. I have a tendency to drop my exercise patterns. I have a tendency to drink a bit more alcohol than I should do. And I have a tendency to start eating badly. All of which, because my brain is telling me they'll make me feel better in the short term. But of course, they're quite the opposite. So the things that I know really help me is the regular exercise, and along with that, the chance to just reflect, because the two go hand in hand with me. It's making sure that I'm sort of getting a decent amount of sleep and I'm not sort of burning the candle at both ends. Increasingly trying to use breath work. I find that works better for me than other types of meditation, but really allowing myself to sort of practice breathing and practice sort of, and it takes time and it takes practice, but that's really, really working for me. But then it's those other things as well. It's just being really conscious of what I'm putting in my body, whether it's what I drink or what I eat, and just trying to get that balance right of all of those elements. Interestingly, Julian, though, I'm very, very aware that I am at my best when I'm working on complex problems with others. So the real lesson I've learned is that it's not actually a want, it's an I need fairly constantly to be with others in a business context, working on complex projects or challenges or problems, no longer necessarily as the team leader, but just being with a group of people, I know brings me harmony in my life. So they're the ones that I sort of am very conscious of now. And again, you can see that to Graham's point about action after acceptance, I know that those are the things that work for me, and I know if I'm not paying attention to those, that my performance will drop, Julian.
And okay, it's just as you're saying there, it's being aware of, I guess, getting to know what your core purpose is, which obviously links to what you do, but also building in sort of daily habits. It's all about consistency, isn't it? It's nothing about one-off things that will help prevent burnout or impede your performance. It's that consistency piece.
And it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the techniques that again just works for me is I build in a thing start of day, even when I was chief exec of some very large enterprises, of block time start of day. So I would capture at least an hour or an hour and a half where it was quiet time, where I could focus on orientating myself for the whole day, clearing the decks, checking all the communication. And then I'd be great for the rest of the day, because a part of my psyche was like, I understand everything that's going on. Whereas if I just launched into my day, there was always that feeling in the back of my mind, had I missed something? So really understanding what are those practices that work for you, and then sticking with them, to your point, Julian, is just so critical.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm an hour at the start of the day. I want to be on my own to get the rest of the day, and then I'm happy to be with lots of people as an extrovert. I'm happy to do that. But it's finding what works for you. And sometimes if you need to go off and go for a walk to clear your head, just to connect with nature, whatever it may be, I think you just got to find your thing and experiment and just try some stuff out. And, I do cold water as well. Some people don't like that, which is fine. Mindfulness, a whole host of stuff. I think it's experimenting, isn't it? And trying to understand what works for you as an individual from how you've been made and created. And just one final question for each of you, as I start with you, Graham. What do you believe in terms of a takeaway message to listeners when it comes to achieving a sustainable high performance and maintaining that well-being as well?
I think two pieces. I'm going to draw very much on what Martin's just said. I think one is understanding your own. Having worked in the sport area quite a lot, I'd say it's understanding your own zone. You've got to work out what your triggers are, and then work on if that is exercise, if it's meditation, whatever it might be. And then I think the second one, and in Toolkit for Turbulence, when we put that together, we interviewed Professor Tanya Munro. She's the Chief Defence Scientist in Australia. And I asked her, what's critical to success for you and for your organisation? You've got over 2,000 scientists and professionals. And she very quickly, she said, the critical thing for us is to make sure we defeat the defensive mindset. So I'd go back to exactly what Martin said. I think for all of your listeners, at any given moment, at any given day, your mindset is somewhere between defensive and defending and opportunity. Where is it at any given moment? If you can be aware of that and then just build the skills to be able to move towards the opportunity, you set yourself up for success, provided you've got that basic understanding of your zone and you're working on it. I think those are the criticals.
Thank you, Graham. How about you, Martin?
Yeah, so one I touched on briefly early on, Julian, is just accept the externality of change, and so embrace uncertainty. It's going to happen. Ambiguity is going to be everywhere. Don't resist it. Don't deny it. Don't try to control it. Just accept it, and instead focus on the things that you can control. The second one would have been self-care, but we've talked a lot about that. So instead, the one that I'll throw in instead is, without doubt, from the leaders that Graham and I speak to, Julian, when we ask them, what's the superpower today for leaders? It's vulnerability. It's the ability to actually, own your own values, be transparent about what drives you to succeed, and be vulnerable with people. Get comfortable with not having to be the sage on the stage. Be the coach on the side. Lean on others. Ask for them help. Accept feedback. Share when you've made mistakes. That just seems to, and as a stress reliever, Julian, when you can truly relax with your team and your organization and be vulnerable and no longer think that in this age of uncertainty and ambiguity, you need to have all the answers or you're not doing your job well, the stress will jump off your shoulders. You'll be the coach that your people need. And you'd be amazed how that will allow you to go opportunity and adaptive thinking rather than staying defensive. And so those would be the two that I'd wrap up with, Julian.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Graham. There's some great, I think, nuggets of insights, but also advice for people listening to this episode. I really appreciate all what you've shared, a number of models, also from your own experience as well. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for doing that, Martin?
Yeah, so we've got the book that Graham and I co-authored that was published by Wiley last November. We've got a great website, which is toolkitforturbulence1word.com. And Julian, there's a lot of free tools there that people can pick up and use. But that's where there's a contact form there. Graham and I would love to hear from you. We're also both on LinkedIn. So feel free to find us on LinkedIn and contact us that way as well. And we'd love to hear from you. And to everybody that's listening, I know I speak for both of us when we just say, look, very best of luck on your leadership journey. And we wish you well. And Julian, thanks for the opportunity to have a chat.
Thank you, Graham.
Thanks, Julian. I absolutely, as always, echo Martin's words. He is a wonderful role model for exactly what he's describing from a leadership point of view. So it's been a privilege to work with him and a privilege to spend the time with you. Thanks, Julian, and the best to your listeners.